Welcome to СивилНet. My guest today is Dr. Laurence Broers. He's a London-based scholar, the Caucasus Program Director of Conciliation Resources, and an Associate Fellow at Chatham House's Russia and Eurasia program. Laurence studies and writes on the Armenia and Azerbaijan conflict. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Broers.
Thank you, Annie, for inviting me.
So we are 1 year past the 44-day Nagorno Karabakh War, and this war started on September 27, 2020 and ended on November 9. The war ended, but the hostile actions of the victorious party, which is Azerbaijan, continue. So what is for you the main goal, the logic behind this, and what is your assessment of the past year?
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to speak to you today. Yes, indeed, 1 year has passed, and we still have many conflict dynamics unfolding in the region. I think, in a sense, Azerbaijan perhaps has learned some lessons from the 90s and not others. As the winning party, it is seeking to put through a peace agreement as soon as possible, and not to fall into the situation that Armenia fell into in the 90s, when it was not able to consolidate a military victory with a peace agreement. And so it's a maximum pressure strategy in a way to force a peace through. But in that sense, the lessons have not been learned from the 90s. You cannot extort a peace agreement out of your opponent. So, I mean, the way that I see it is that military victories, when we look at the broader history of the post-Soviet South Caucasus, military victories did not lead to the resolution of conflicts. Rather, they led to their repackaging in new and unpredictable forms. Yeah, I mean, I think we really need to see a very different kind of dynamic in place, a sustained de-escalation across multiple dimensions before we can start talking about prospects for a comprehensive peace.
So Baku claims, as you said, the conflict is over. At least they want a peace agreement, as you said. However, the international mediators stress the importance of resolving the issue through negotiations. What is your thought about this?
Well, I think that after war, there is often a rush to define the new narrative. I remember when I first started working on this conflict in the mid-2000s, that I would sometimes hear from Armenian interlocutors that the conflict was over and the rest of the world needed to just catch up with this reality. And I think we are hearing a similar thing from Azerbaijan today. Clearly, the dynamics, particularly since May of this year, have shown a widening of the conflict space. New theatres in Syunik, in Gerharkunik, around Nakhichevan, where we are seeing
sovereign territories of Armenia in that case.
Yes, in the case of Syunik and Gerharkunik, new ceasefire violations and a whole array of coercive bargaining tactics. And so, in that sense, you know, there are still very visible conflict dynamics. But beyond all of that, the Second Karabakh War has resulted in a new geopoliticization of this conflict, of the South Caucasus, and has lifted many issues up and out of Armenian and Azerbaijani control. And so my response to this idea that the conflict is over is, can we really say that the conflict is over when it is still resulting in the degradation of Armenian and Azerbaijani sovereignty over the long term? Can we talk about the conflict being over when there are still elites on one side of the conflict or the other who depend on the conflict for their legitimacy? I don't think that we can. As I mentioned, I think, you know, the conflict has simply been repackaged and reformulated, and it will resurface in unpredictable ways in the future.
So international mediators are right. Negotiations are still needed. Nothing is done.
Yes, I mean, I think we do need to see, obviously, a diplomatic process. What we are seeing today, I think, is a a new era in fractured mediations. So Russia has the trilateral process that it is leading with Armenia and Azerbaijan, and then there is the Minsk process. The Minsk group has, in a way, by default, become the guardian of the most difficult issues that divide Armenians and Azerbaijanis today, namely the political relationship between the Karabakh Armenian population and the Azerbaijani state. Meanwhile, Russia may be able to move forward on certain sort of step-by-step practical steps on particular bilateral issues. But in a way, what we're seeing is a reappearance of this dynamic between step-by-step approaches and the package approach that would be comprehensive. That comprehensive solution, the only body that has a mandate for that is the Minsk group. And so I think we can ask, how productive can either of these processes be for as long as they are separate from one another? And when we think back to the 90s, there were multiple efforts to mediate. Russia had its own track that it was pursuing. Other parties sought to come in. The CSCE, as it then was, the predecessor of the OSCE, Iran. And the Minsk group design was actually a response to this, to actually unify efforts to transform the conflict. And it may be in the future that we will see a new consolidation of these mediation efforts, as each of them proves to be unproductive on its own, certainly with regard to a comprehensive settlement of the conflict.
Armenian and Azerbaijani leaders exchanged willingness to meet. What do you think are must be the priority in the negotiations if that happens, if they meet?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one priority should be simply that they should meet in the region. They should meet on Armenian or Azerbaijani soil. This has been something that's been missing for decades in the talks. And I think, basically, we need to see a sustained de-escalation. So I think, initially, measures that would create an atmosphere conducive to progress on the core substantive issues, I think, should be the priority. It's been a very tense year. Expectations that, things could move on have not been fulfilled. People are still dying. And so I think steps to de-escalate, to transform the rhetoric in particular. We still see very hostile, aggressive rhetoric in order to create an atmosphere where more substantive discussions could actually take place and could have more plausibility.
Let's talk about the issue of the status of Nagorno Karabakh. The issue of the status is at the core of the conflict, and so far nothing is clear about the status for Nagorno Karabakh. And in this context, the current context we have, what are the possible ways to achieve a final status for Nagorno Karabakh? Is it feasible for you, in your opinion?
It's a very challenging question, and I think the wider understanding is that this issue has been deferred. As I mentioned, the Minsk group is now the guardian of this issue, if you will. It will not be addressed within a unilateral Russian-led format. I think over time the relevance of this issue will increase. Right now, of course, the fundamental issues are security for the population in Nagorno Karabakh. We don't hear a lot about this from the Ceasefire Monitoring Center, but there are ceasefire violations on a weekly, if not day-to-day basis. So I think security and simply ensuring the security of the civilians living there is the first sort of priority. But over the long term, this issue of status, I think, will circle back into the center of negotiations. It is the core issue that is driving the conflict. What should be the relationship between the Karabakh Armenian population and the Azerbaijani state? For as long as there are deeply securitized relations, for as long as there are plausible perceptions of an existential threat to this community, this is the opening for a Russian peacekeeping presence. This is what justifies, what makes the need for such a presence clear. And I think this is a dynamic, over time, the Russian presence in Nagorno Karabakh will become more of an issue in Azerbaijani considerations. And one hopes that one would see increasingly a differentiated approach by Azerbaijani policymakers to different Armenian communities. Azerbaijan needs to have a relationship with Karabakh Armenians, with the Republic of Armenia, and with the diaspora. In each of these theatres, there are different interests and different interactions are necessary. So, a key is to move on from this, mythologized Armenian other, and to break that enemy image down. Unfortunately, for now, we see very limited signs of that.
The 44-day war completely changed the security environment, both in Armenia and especially in Karabakh. If Armenia has certain guarantees from the bilateral agreements with Russia and CSTO membership, Karabakh security and future, we talked about that, is critically dependent on Russia's peacekeeping forces in the land. And this peacekeeping forces agreement has actually a term. It finishes in 4 years, and there is no guarantee that it will be prolongated. So what would be the possible scenario in 2025?
Well, personally, I think it's very unlikely that the peacekeeping mandate would be terminated at that time. It's very, very difficult to predict developments, but it is hard to see on present indicators that the security situation would transform to the extent that a peacekeeping mission would no longer be necessary in order to guarantee the security of the population in Nagorno Karabakh. The Russian-Azerbaijani relationship is going to be a very sensitive and key relationship in the region over the coming period. It is a different kind of peacekeeping mission from others that Russia has fielded in the former Soviet space. It is there sort of with Azerbaijani permission, and it may become one issue in a broader menu of issues where Russia and Azerbaijan are trading off benefits and concessions. I think an awful lot also depends on the personal relationship between the presidents of Russia and Azerbaijan, which always adds an element of unpredictability into these issues, because if there would be leadership change, where does that leave the policy designed and implemented by that person? So I think we will see most likely a Russian presence in Nagorno-Karabakh for longer than 5 years.
Let's talk about Turkey now. Turkey during the war was was actively involved in the war, as the country supported Azerbaijan militarily, politically. On the other hand, in the context of the war, we saw that Turkey was out of the November 9 agreement, and it is Russia that dislocated the peacekeeping forces in Nagorno-Karabakh. How do you see this equilibrium?
Well, that's a really fascinating question. What we see is this kind of Turkish military supremacy through the phenomenon of a largely, though not exclusively, Turkish supplied and trained army defeating a largely Russian trained and equipped army in Nagorno-Karabakh. And yet, then we see Russian diplomatic supremacy. So Turkey has been able to come in and transform the strategic context, change the status quo, but has not been able to sustain and to really gain a seat at the high table. Russia has been able to squeeze Turkey out, giving just a symbolic concession in the form of the ceasefire monitoring center near Agdam. And I think what we see in a way is that Russia has a broader spectrum of channels and mechanisms. It can act unilaterally through the deployment of a peacekeeping mission and a monopoly on that effectively in Nagorno-Karabakh itself. It can act bilaterally, cooperating with Turkey, not just on Nagorno-Karabakh, of course, but also on the other conflicts in the wider Middle East. But it can also act multilaterally, Russia still has a foot very firmly placed in the Minsk group. And this is Turkey's weak point in a way, because Turkey has effectively is seen as a party to the conflict in Armenia, and that limits its diplomatic capacity and potential over the short term. So in that sense, we see the South Caucasus is sort of returning to this pattern of constrained external hegemons. Neither Russia nor Turkey nor any other power is able to project a comprehensive influence into the region in terms of sector, in terms of geography, and is not strong enough to completely exclude any other power. So in that sense, this multipolar reordering of the region is something that is going to be with us for some time, and unfortunately I think it augurs a lot of instability, and it will be primarily the people in the region who will suffer.
And what do you think that Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's objective is in Azerbaijan and in the region in general?
Well, I'm not a Turkey expert, but it seems to me that Turkey has become one of a number of regional powers in the world that sees opportunity in multipolarity, that has become skeptical of its previous role in a unipolar world order, and is investing in a post-Western reality. There are also issues around the revival of a kind of neo-imperial identity, neo-Ottomanism, but also a pragmatic sense of the need for Turkish foreign policy to assume strategic depth, to see more opportunity, more connectivity, more linkages in the Middle East, in the wider Middle East, including the South Caucasus. And I think here, in the longer term, Turkey could have a much broader spectrum of soft power to deploy, potentially than Russia. Turkey has been the core pillar of the main axis of regional cooperation that we have seen so far in the post-Soviet South Caucasus, the Azerbaijan-Georgia-Turkey relationship, BTC, BTK, pipelines and railways and so on. And so, if the security issues could be settled, I think Turkey would have a quite wide bandwidth to engage. It also has, I think, in Azerbaijan, a very reliable partner. Turkey and Azerbaijan are linked not only through personal chemistry of leaders, but through culture, through language, through quite dense networks and ties at different levels. And so in that sense, I think this will continue to be a key shaping relationship. And in that sense, I don't think that Turkey can be completely squeezed out. I think in the long term, it may have a wider bandwidth for more influence in the region.
And last question, what are and what should be Armenia's foreign policy and security priorities in this new reality?
I think the key priority for Armenia is state building. Armenia now exists in borders that it has never existed in de facto, or de jure, I should say, as an independent state. And we see this in terms of the issues around roads, the infrastructure, the basic infrastructure of the state still dates from a time when Armenia was a province of a much larger state, the Soviet Union. So I think to build an effective state that would work to integrate the country's peripheries, reduce their strategic vulnerability, build institutions, and make Armenia a country where people want to live and want to stay is crucial. In doing that, I think what is very important is for Armenia not to sink back into a competitive authoritarian regime, such as the one that existed here until 2018. We have seen, I think, many of the impacts of the long-term corruption and the ceding of sovereignty that happened in that time. And there are also not the structural conditions here in Armenia for sustained authoritarianism. So I think continuing on the path of the values and ideals of the Velvet Revolution is also key. And I think for that, in the aftermath of the Second Karabakh War, there's a huge need for internal dialogue and for a national dialogue on what happened, why it happened. There are papers that have been prepared, the white paper prepared by Robert Aydabirian, Taline Papazian and Gerard Liberizian. There is also the ArmeniaCommission.org paper that was prepared by Simon Sarajan, asking very important questions. So I think sustaining this debate to really learn from the experience, the awful experience of the last 15 months, I think is crucial.
Well, thank you, Dr. Broers, for this talk.
Thank you very much, Hani.
Thank you for watching and continue to follow CivilNet.